Hi, everyone. This is Meredith with OHA, and this is the Equity Subcommittee meeting for Wednesday, March 2nd. And I wanted you all to know that I've started the recording for this meeting, and that we also have automated closed captions and a live transcript going. However, it's a real-time computer-based transcription, so it's not always accurate. So we apologize if there's anything in there that doesn't accurately match what's being said. And we're asking that members of the public turn their cameras off during the beginning of the meeting, and then we'll have a public comment period at the end. So at the end, you'll be welcome to turn your cameras on. It just helps us have a recording that isn't quite as large when we upload it to the website. And like I said, we'll have a public comment period at the end of the meeting. So thanks.
Afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are here regularly, you know I like to wait a few minutes to allow people to get in here, especially our subcommittee members. So I will take roll really at 3:05 Pacific.
If what we found proves to be true and it's safe, I'll send you.
All right, this is Dr. Rachel Knox for the record, and I'm happy to commence today's Equity Subcommittee meeting, and I'll begin with taking roll. Amber Center. Anne-Marie Backstrom.
Anne-Marie is present.
All right, give me a moment because my roster here just disappeared off my screen. That was weird. Okay, give me a second, everyone.
Dr. Knox, I can also jump in if you need some assistance.
Go ahead, Jesse. My whole internet situation just clonked out on me.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, for the recording, this is Jesse Sweet with OHA assisting with the roll. So Amber Center was not present. Anne-Marie Backstrom is present. Carolyn Cruz. Charlotte James. Claudia Cuentas. Dr. Angela Carter. Dr. Hernandez Wolf. Dr.
Pilar has
Knox.
a conflict
Okay,
today. I'm present.
yes. I believe I saw Elon Higgins. Are you present?
Hey, I'm here.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hadass Alterman. Izzy Ali.
Hi, I'm present. Thank you.
Thanks. Kevin Fitz, I believe you're here.
Yeah, Kevin Fitz here. Thank you.
Rebecca Martinez.
Yes, present. Hi, everyone.
Thank you. Rebecca Rocha, I believe, is absent.
Mhm.
Sarah Gilmore.
I'm here.
Thank you. Dre Wright. Okay, it looks like Dre is not here, and that concludes the roll.
Thank you, Jesse. All right, next on our agenda, we have equity liaison updates. I actually do not believe we've had other subcommittee meetings since we last convened. I might be wrong about that, but I'm fairly certain that that is the case. Certainly, if there's any liaison up here that can correct me, I'll give you a moment. Okay, other than that, the last meeting we had last month was the general board meeting for Psilocybin Services Advisory Board, where we had a lengthy discussion about conflicts of interest. And the board did vote unanimously to proceed with declaring any potential or de facto conflicts of interest in this month's board meeting on March 23rd. And where we will also discuss amendments to our bylaws that really codify an annual declaration for board members, for any sitting board members and subcommittee members on an annual basis. So we can look forward to that. I have been asked if our subcommittee will declare conflicts of interest, and we can certainly put that on the agenda for next meeting. We do not have to wait until the board approves those bylaws to do so, if that is everyone's wish. And with that, I will pass the mic back to you, Jesse, for any OHA program updates.
Thank you. Picking up on the subject of conflicts, I would like to share with you all that the Oregon Government Ethics Commission will be presenting at the next board meeting. That's on March 16th. So they'll be covering conflicts of interest and other requirements under law for public officials. Any subcommittee members who are able to make that meeting, I encourage you to listen in as well. Also, I'll give a rule update, as I always do. We had Rules Advisory Committee convene for testing products and training curriculum recently. Those committees have concluded, and the next step for those rules will be a public comment period from April 1st through April 22nd. We will also have 2 public hearings during that time on April 18th and the 21st. So anyone can provide written comment during the entire comment period. And for those who would like to provide verbal comment, they can do so at the public hearings, which will be virtual public hearings. I would also like to remind everybody, as they're looking at these rules and thinking about their comments, that these rules, which we have out in the world right now as drafts, are just a subset of the entire chapter that will be drafted and adopted prior to our statutory deadline of December 31st of this year. So we will have final rules that I'd mentioned in May for a small subset, and then the remainder of the rules will be adopted in late December. That's all I have, so I will turn it back over to Chair Knox.
Okay, thank you, Jesse. All right, next on our agenda is a discussion, and we have John Dennis here today with us to field any questions or comment on our consideration of requirements for entheogenic practitioner protections, really. So I hope everybody had a chance to view his presentation to the licensing subcommittee last week. He also supplied us with the most up-to-date draft of his proposal titled Privileges and Duties of Entheogenic Practitioners. I am aware that the licensing subcommittee tomorrow has this on their agenda to discuss and even move to make a recommendation, a formal recommendation to the board for its consideration as well. We do not yet have quorum today to do that, should any of us want to, at the end of this discussion. But that is certainly something that we can also consider doing if consensus is to support the recommendations to, properly center and support some privileges to folks who are wanting to exercise their religious liberty and specialty, whether that's they consider that themselves spiritual practitioners or entheogenic practitioners or otherwise. So, John, are you here with us? I believe I saw you.
Hey, Dr. Knox, I'm here.
Hey, is there anything you would like to say to us to kick off the conversation? Otherwise, I'm just going to open the floor to people's responses and impressions and maybe any questions that we all might have for you.
Thank you so much to this subcommittee for the opportunity to be here and kind of present on this today. It's something that's very close to my heart, and it's a fairly complex issue, the intersection of religious liberties and Measure 109. Put quite a considerable thought and effort into coming up with a kind of a nuanced kind of framework that balances both religious liberties on the one hand, kind of the state's interest in making sure that there's adequate oversight and accountability and safety mechanisms on the other hand, while also still kind of balancing equity considerations and the hope that this program doesn't perpetuate racial, health, or even spiritual inequity within the measure. So it was kind of an attempt to balance all these things in a way that still can hopefully make everybody happy and invite as much of the underground as possible to come above ground in practice within the measure. One of my concerns is that if Measure 109 regulations are overly restrictive, it won't really be attractive for underground practitioners to come above ground and practice. And I believe that kind of it's in everybody's best interest to bring this above ground and into the light of day. But in order for that to occur, there has to be kind of liberal rules and permissions that are given to kind of people who have ceremony and treat these things in kind of a sacred manner. So it's kind of a really delicate balancing act that this tries to strike. And I think that in general, the framework that I start from is asking two main questions. One is, if Maria Sabina were alive today, would she be allowed to lead ceremony in Oregon? And the second question is, if Maria Sabina were alive today, would she be able to afford ceremony in Oregon? And I think these are two critical questions that we have to ask ourselves. And if the answer to either one of those questions is no, it means we're not doing good enough. And so I just hope that we can talk about this. So just to kind of put some context on the framework, in case it might not always be clear from the minutia of the proposed regulations themselves. But the idea behind it is that it creates a community container for psilocybin for spiritual and religious communities and theogenic communities to come and to own their own means of production and to basically be the stewards of it instead of, so I think of it as more as a horizontal model for psychedelic services as opposed to a more top-down model, which I think is the service center kind of, selling it to, through a manufacturer. This would allow, nonprofit spiritual and religious communities to create their own community container and provide ceremony within kind of the overall parameters of the measure that still provide for some safety mechanisms and for oversight. So I don't know if people have questions. I mean, there's kind of a lot there to dig in, and I don't know how I can be most helpful to this subcommittee in its own decision-making process around these. But there's potentially a lot of issues to dig into, and I'm not sure the kind of best way to start. But if you'll have questions, thank you.
Thank you, John. And I just want to, just for a bit of housekeeping, I see a hand raised already from the public. This is going to be a closed conversation until we do open up for public comment in the last 15 minutes of the meeting, just so all are aware. But if you have questions, please write them down, and we hope to be able to answer them, or excuse me, hear them. Comments or questions, hear them in the last 15 minutes of this meeting. The one thing I want to say before I open it up to all else is that something that struck me as really most poignant in your presentation to the licensing committee and in your slides is that this notion that 109 must give the most religious liberty possible, right, within that construct. And your two questions that you shared with us today, right, I think most of us know the answer. That either one of those questions right now, considering the restrictive nature of some of our recommendations thus far, would be no, right? Maria Sabina probably would not thrive in our current framework as it's thus far been contemplated, right? Jesse Sweet, shared with us that the draft rules are just that, and they're a very minor subset of the rules that will be finalized in December at that. So by my estimate, we still have time to get this as right as possible.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Dr. Knox. Yeah, that's part of the challenge here is definitely to this Oregon is just the first state to go with this. And so I just think it's extra critical that Oregon really create kind of the community container, because it really is the container that has always been the container for kind of psychedelic healing. It's been in a ritual and a ceremony and a community context. And it's not that there's only room for one model, but within the very flexible framework of Measure 109 itself, it creates room for multiple kind of models to kind of coexist peacefully under the measure. And so this is kind of an attempt at creating a closed loop system within the measure that would, just provide more room for sacred practice and religious activity. And thank you for also mentioning the point from the licensing subcommittee. So when Oregon starts wrestling with the question of religious freedom, it has, with respect to the use of psilocybin or other psychedelic materials, it begins not in the first instance with its own decision making, but it exists in a broader national framework on the same issue. Which, so if Oregon does the absolute maximum that it can possibly do, if it gives religious practitioners the most liberties that it can conceivably allow under the terms of the measure, that's already less freedom than religious organizations currently have under the federal protections. So anything that is less than the most Oregon is capable of doing here would be kind of at odds with the trajectory of kind of history on this issue, which has been to kind of allow more and more protections for this kind of work. And so, so the framework is trying to maximize that to the extent allowed under the measure.
Which is inherent, you said inherently less, provides less freedom than people already can exercise under the federal RFRA, right?
Correct. But luckily, because this is separate from the RFRA analysis, there are, and for those who don't know, RFRA is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was passed by Congress unanimously in the House and by a vote of 97-3 in the Senate in 1993, just 3 years after the US Supreme Court issued its decision in the Oregon v. Smith case, which was the case where Oregon decided to allow, basically religious persecution for peyote practitioners, for Native American church members who practice peyote pursuant to religious exercise. So I believe in a certain sense, Oregon has a certain penance to pay here because we did kind of screw this up for everyone, resulting in this broad law of unanimous consensus on a national level. So I believe that kind of sets the tone and the frame for Oregon's own kind of wrestling with these issues here.
I love that. Oregon has a penance to pay. It's true. Do I see any hands from our members? Yeah, I don't. So I guess I'll kick off with the first question. So I'm gonna go ahead.
Sorry, Dr. Knox. I just turned my video on, which doesn't count as raising my hand, but I can raise my hand.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. And obviously, I also want to hear your questions. I was just thinking about sharing a couple thoughts to see if they'd be helpful, also just for some discussion. So first off, yeah, super glad we're having this discussion. Thank you, John, for putting this together. And I really want to appreciate at this time the named and unnamed spiritual care practitioners of all kinds who have offered their thoughts and insight into this process. Not just here in Oregon, although also here in Oregon, but because this is an issue, kind of like you said, John, that has implications far beyond the state. And I think it's really important to take it with that level of seriousness. And it's very interesting to me to think about like the fateful Smith case, 1992, 30 years ago, and where we are today, and kind of like the framing of Oregon's positionality within the country as a whole with respect to religious freedom. And I think it's fantastic that this conversation has come up in this context, because one of the big things that I've personally wrestled with over the course of this process with 109 has been like what exactly these services are for and how they're characterized. And I think the expansion and understanding that services, psilocybin services per measure 109 may include therapeutic or certain kinds of kind of holistic or healthcare services, spiritual care services, whether or not they fall within the kind of confines of healthcare services, which I think is an interesting question to engage with, is absolutely its own form of legitimate use that we have lots of evidence for and lots of just de facto practice for. So I think that that's all, it's really important. And I have a few, what I'll do is maybe share some rhetorical questions just to start, because things that I've been thinking through, and then I'll share a few comments. So the first is kind of generally just for us as a subcommittee to be thinking about is how many of the considerations that are included in the proposal can be cross-referenced with recommendations that we've already made or have made or would want to make. And I was thinking a lot about some of the discussions we had earlier on, I think at the end of last year, where we were thinking about recommendations that, for example, might include reviewing a certain policy or rule that gets set at the end of this year, after 1 year or after 2 years. So there's a way to ensure that there's like some sort of review of, I'm just thinking things from testing requirements to requirements for products and so on, all things that are also considered under this proposal, right? So I think that in general, when I'm looking across like what we are already recommending and what's in here, you could see it as lowering or changing barriers to entry by making it easier for certain kinds of practitioners to have access. Like that to me is something that we as a subcommittee have been going for the whole time, which I like. So in my mind, anything that's going to lower the barrier to entry while maintaining safety and integrity is a good thing because it's going to lower the cost. It's going to make it so more people can participate if they like, and it allow for a broader diversity of practitioners to enter, not just ones from like mental health care or the Western healthcare system. I think that that's a critical piece. So I love that. Importantly, to the kind of the more meta points, I think that there is a question which I think you responded to, John, both in your presentation and some other things I've read, with respect to how this does or does not interact with issues related to religious freedom as they currently exist in the state. And one thing that I think is interesting is that there's kind of what I'm seeing as a spiritual religious gap that is kind of being tested in this conversation about psychedelics, because US First Amendment law presumably protects certain kinds of religious freedom. But because we're seeing such a resurgence and increase in spiritual but not religious practice, my mind is like, are we letting a whole host of activities remain unprotected because of like a cultural technicality or a cultural association with a certain kind of religious practice? So when I see like the expanding not just to religion, and I think this is important, not just religious use, but entheogenic and broadly sacramental use, it allows us to more properly, I think, like recognize that there's a huge body of use that does not squarely fall within medicine, may not squarely fall within a formal religious setting, which, you know, is up for discussion, but maybe involves a specific type of carried tradition and institution, and yet is a safe, ethical, efficacious, supportive way to practice when it's held right and when the accountability and the structure is there. So big picture, I'm like, big yes to this possibility, to this expansion. And I think my question really comes down to how are the details sorted? And to boil it all down, my big question is, what would this look like filtered through the OHA actual rulemaking process? Like what would end up on the other side? Let's say we move forward with the recommendation, maybe other subcommittees do also. There would still have to be a squaring up of the, you know, current law as it's written, the current rules as they've been accepted. So I do think that there's some like pragmatic implementation stuff that would be worth sorting. And it makes me wonder how much time there is to start that process and to continue to engage with that process. But big picture, those are kind of the things that I've been thinking about. And then one last tiny thing, and then I'll pause. I know I've been saying a lot, is just to your specific point about Maria Sabina, John, one of the things I was thinking about that isn't cognized by this particular proposal, as far as I understand it, but also I think would be very difficult, if not impossible to do in a fully state-run system, is working with traveling practitioners. And that's something that I see talked about a lot, especially primarily in the ayahuasca world, because there's so many people who are coming across countries. That may be less of an issue to some extent, but it's not a non-issue. So I think insofar as we're talking about spiritual care practice and what's required, I do think that it's unlikely that the state of Oregon could have like a provisional license of some kind for some, because I do think it's good that there's like the still high training requirements, not because I think it's always needed by everybody, but because there does have to be some way for the state to understand who's protected by their frame and who isn't protected, part of the issue here in the first place. But those are just some of the general considerations I've had. I'm like down to go more into detail on any of them, but just wanted to throw all that stuff out there since I got a chance to take a close look in the last couple of days, and really appreciate the effort. Really stoked to see this discussion happening, and yeah, really glad to get into these nitty-gritty details. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Izzy. Yeah, there's a lot to this topic, and so I mean, it's kind of absurd in a certain sense to think we could possibly cover this in an hour or less, you know. But you touch on a lot of really big points here, particularly on the growing. I think people who self-identify in the United States as spiritual but not religious is currently the fastest growing group of religious self-identification presently. It's an ever-growing kind of number of people, and it's largely, I think, because many of us have certain kind of religious trauma, and we just don't like we have bad associations even with the word religion, and we try to stay far from it. And that doesn't necessarily, I mean, so whatever the essence of religion is, if somebody's traumatized by the thought of a religious institution, I don't think that bars it from being authentically a religious practice, however you want to define that in a kind of a careful and nuanced way. But if I see one of the DOJ lawyers, I might be here on the Zoom today, but if the DOJ and Oregon were to decide differently on the issue of the Oregon Constitution, so the proposal assumes that the Oregon Constitution does not allow the state to discriminate against a non-religious practitioner. So the scope of who gets these privileges under the proposal is essentially both religious and non-religious operations, communities, religious and non-religious communities. So it has to be done in a way that can kind of capture the full breadth of all of that activity while still being kind of a limited and discrete system. So I've chosen under the model out of kind of consideration for OHA to not have the state, issue the privileges individually, but to give them as an entire bundle, for people who are using it for religious and spiritual entheogenic purposes. Because that would be really burdensome, and the state wouldn't really probably want to be in the role of having to decide who to give them to or who not to give them to. That would be just something that I don't think the state doesn't want to have to do, and I don't think religious practitioners or spiritual practitioners don't want to have to feel like they're begging for permission either. So the terms of like who gets entry into this kind of the entheogenic privilege kind of side of it, should be kind of I've termed it as an honor system. I think there are substantial penalties such as loss of licensure, which would be the death knell of I think many entheogenic communities if they were to no longer be able to operate under the measure. So I think that the disciplinary oversight that's available through the proposal, does still kind of achieve the state's purposes of maintaining safe practice and having that be done in a responsible manner. So that's a big part of it. So with the so even if the DOJ when it reviews this decides that the Oregon Constitution doesn't require it to be extended to non-religious practitioners, that's my reading of some of the Oregon constitutional case law. But if the DOJ were to decide it differently, I still think nonetheless that would be the right answer to the question, because we do have kind of this growing movement where people identify as spiritual, not religious. And when you're dealing with psychedelics where the degree of the mystical experience is directly correlated to the success of the client's outcomes, it really is kind of a spiritual or mystical type of therapy or program that really is bigger than religion. I think entheogen is a similar but distinct category from religious. I think it includes religious, but I think it also includes something that's not quite religious. So that's kind of the thing about the term. So thanks. I see Rebecca has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you, John, for this. It's been really helpful just to sort of have wheels turning around this topic. It's such a need, and it's been a struggle for a couple of years, sort of confronting this binary that folks are sort of feeling they have to decide which path to take in terms of practice. And so I recognize the need, definitely. I think where I get stuck and I'm interested, I'm sure you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I looked through the presentation a couple of times, but I think I'm stuck just understanding some of the overlays of what's being proposed and, logistically what this would mean, as well as what's legally possible. I don't think I have enough understanding on that level to know like what we would be recommending. So I wonder, because I feel like I'm sort of keeping up, and then there's things that like I don't fully understand all the intersections with these different governing bodies. So I think what might be helpful is if you could give us like, at least for me, like maybe like the 4 bullet points of like, how does this proposal differ Specifically, I think in my mind, I've thought there may be spiritual groups. I know of groups who that is the nature of their practice and who intend to open a service center within the existing parameters. So what are the special privileges that are being requested? I don't know that that's really the right language, but for like a religious use, and is what you're proposing like a separate type of license? And then I guess the secondary question is this possible? Thanks.
Yeah, and Izzy, I see your hands up. Do you want to respond to Rebecca directly or, okay. So thank you for those. Those are excellent questions. The proposal does what it does through several kind of key items that that allow kind of these communities extra autonomy and more kind of latitude to operate without extensive regulation and kind of parsing apart the details of it. And so the main mechanisms that it does that through, first off, are allowing a peer support system to exist within like ceremony, basically within administration sessions where group administration sessions where people take psilocybin. There's talk that there's likely going to be kind of a predetermined facilitator to client ratio in group sessions, and that ratio is likely to be one of the main drivers of the cost of services, because it is something you can't really negotiate away once it's kind of set in law. But the proposal would have communities kind of give them the opportunity to deviate from the generally applicable facilitator to client ratios, where they can kind of certify members of their own community to serve in a peer support role. This isn't intended that people would be certified on day one, that they'd have to undergo kind of a training or some kind of process internally within their community to be able to do that. And then that once the community certifies the client, essentially, who's providing peer support, that they can serve some of the same type of supervision roles that are, I think, typically assumed to belong to the facilitator. So within the parameters of the measure itself, we cannot negotiate away the presence of a facilitator. There has to be at least one present while psilocybin's being purchased and consumed and experienced. So that we can't do away with that. And frankly, I'm not sure that we should either. Especially as this program's getting running, it probably makes sense to keep a person there, and that people may disagree with that. But I'm not advocating that we do away with that completely. I think, but this provides some kind of framing of how the factors that a community should consider when arriving at its own kind of a facilitator to client ratio, so that it can just keep it as low as possible, so that it doesn't have to just basically drive up the cost of ceremony. Because when you think about people's access to ceremony or their religious practice, it's something that should be reasonably affordable. So that, many people, when they go to their religious institution or the religious community, they do it on a regular basis. So this is not going to be something that people save up for once or twice a year. Even this is intended as like something that's going to be an ongoing kind of regular thing for these kind of entheogenic communities. So that access piece is really important, and it only just kind of, it's a certain privilege, and we're not giving it to just anybody. It's people who certify that this is serious, and they have to be under my proposal a nonprofit organization. So it can't be just like a workaround on the safety rules that are generally applicable. This has to be done for a nonprofit motive, essentially. So that's kind of one of the other pieces. Does that answer your? So that's the first kind of big one, I guess, is the peer support, and another one is the kind of relaxed rules around the handling, growing, and storage of products, and testing of products. So many, as you may expect, entheogenic and religious communities that have a sacramental relationship with psilocybin mushrooms view many of them, the mushrooms, as something more than just a bottle of aspirin. These are objects of religious reverence and that are held in high regard and treated and handled with great care and great respect. And this basically tries to create some space so that communities can handle products in accordance with their convictions and their beliefs and surrounding the products themselves. And a good kind of side effect or side benefit of that, allowing religious and entheogenic communities to do those kinds of protections or those options to handle and perhaps not even just send tests every harvest batch or harvest lot. I forget the term for verbiage used in the draft testing rules, but by working by not requiring testing unless actually indicated by a reason or upon the specific written request by OHA, it also drives the cost of products down. So it's just kind of the question is, how much regulation does a psilocybin program like Oregon's really need in order to be safe? And I think if we put it in the context of a sincere community, I don't think it's really terribly much oversight or regulation. So this tries to kind of get out, have the state get out of the way, except when there's overstepping of the bounds. So that's kind of one of the general themes throughout is like but by allowing a spiritual or entheogenic community to handle and do these things on their own, the goals of religious liberties and equitable access are actually really closely aligned. It just luckily turns out. So I think those are the big ones. So the testing would only be required under the proposal if I think under the draft testing rules, there's 6 types of testing, and I believe 3 of them are only required if requested in writing by OHA. And so this would basically add all of those testing varieties to that same system, with the possible exception of solvent testing for extracts. I think that might actually make sense to require that to be kind of a regular or ongoing, like every batch or whatever the term is, to have that be done without exception. But particularly for products that are created there on site at a service center by a community, that they not have to be just like routinely tested unless there's actually like a reason to do so. But if there is a reason to do so, they'll comply and make sure that there's nothing kind of weird happening with the product. So again, it's an attempt at striking this balance in a way that provides support and for communities to handle appropriately and keep costs low. So I think those are the big bullet points of it. And then it also so the other things that it has this list of privileges across all different license types except for testing. But those privileges were drafted without really knowing what the overall rules for the program will be. So I probably erred on the side of throwing in privileges that don't really need to be there, that will probably be covered by the rest of the program. And the hope is that once we know how the rest of the program is going to be done, we'll come in and cut out all those rules that are maintained elsewhere, to get to Izzy's point a little earlier. Because we want the list of both privileges and duties to probably be as short as possible and specific to entheogenic practitioners, because the general duties that will for facilitators and service centers and things will still apply. But this is an extra set of permissions, an extra set of responsibilities that go with it. So. Izzy, I think you had your.
Go ahead, Izzy.
Well, I was going to see if Rebecca wanted to. I don't know if you were just following up to what you were saying. If you wanted to ask, because I have a question that's like kind of it's a related but kind of a different direction. So I want to make sure that.
Yeah, I'm gonna hold off on my follow-up question because I have several, but they might get answered in the course of conversation. So thank you.
But I'll jump in real quick because my comment.
Okay. Cool.
My comment is right on that. So yeah, in reading through the proposal, I think, John, what you've done is brilliant. I think this proposal actually does work. Rebecca, you asked the question, does this work? I think it does work. within Measure 109. And I think the delight is going to really be in the details, the rule, right? Some of the rules that have been recommended and drafted thus far would restrict some of activities, right? John, in your proposal, right, as you contemplated it. And what you just said, what you just closed on, I think is what resonated with me the most, right? You want to keep these privileges and duties, the list of these things as short as possible, and make sure they align with the broad duties that everyone else is going to be subject to. But I personally feel like this proposal could or really should result in more rules that create exceptions to those granted entheogenic practitioner privileges, right? Relaxed rules, as you put it. So I do see this as workable. Izzy, I love your your suggestion, your rhetorical question, but really it's a suggestion that we examine the recommendations that our subcommittee has contemplated thus far, juxtapose them to John's. And that doesn't have to happen, before we might want to vote to recommend that the board review this and consider this as well. But I just think that would be a pretty neat exercise for us to do together.
Yeah, part of the fun in drafting this, to be perfectly honest, was to just envision if there was like a corner for sacred practice that was separate from the rest of the measure, what that could look like. And I realize there's probably a lot in there that doesn't need to be specific to sacred practice, but I think there's probably opportunity to apply some of the pieces to just the broader program. But I think if we're going to create a space for kind of entheogenic religious or sacred practice under the measure, I start from the position that it would have had to have been affordable to Maria Sabina if she were alive today and wanted to do ceremony in Oregon. So, that kind of if you start from that premise and how it can be done safely and how much safety oversight is really necessary, I think it's not really that radical, considering that spiritual community has been the container for psychedelics since as early as humanity, to my best of my knowledge, has had a relationship with plant medicines and fungi medicines. So it kind of just only makes sense at a certain level.
Yeah, this is a smile. Also, I might comment out. This has been such a good discussion. I'm glad it's continuing. I agree with that last point, and I will add that one thing I like to remind people when we talk about historical context of traditional use is that the psyche of the average American who would get to use psychedelics for the first time or in a legitimized context for the first time is also something to be considered of. And I don't like the idea of over policing or the state over parenting, you could say, either. So I do think that it's important to have those kind of bloom of different practices that can kind of be associated with each other and under a certain umbrella. So it's like both, and where I agree with that, and also like now we have targeted online advertising. It's a different paradigm than people have been using in the past, and I do worry about that. But putting the advertising and that kind of more intense stuff aside for now, I do have one meta question that I think is really good for us to be thinking about, and probably something that the other subcommittees ought to also be thinking about, which is the question of cost parity and how to engage with the cost question. I think one of the benefits of this proposal, and kind of going to what you were saying, Dr. Knox, is like, well, there's certain ways that making some changes to the current either language or proposed rules could lower the cost and thus lower the barrier to entry. That is a very good thing. We want that to be true. But as you said, John, we want to do that to be true across the board. And one concern I have is when you have a system that impliedly requires someone to ascribe to a certain belief system in order to receive reduced cost services. And I really worry about, like, down the line, I think that because the training requirements are similar, one could argue that the quality of care, whether it's sacramental or under kind of the broad services system, are comparable. And one does not need to say like, oh, like one version of services is better than the other. I don't think that's what this sets up as. But I'm just thinking of what are the downstream effects of incentivizing one category of use, while also the other category of use remains expensive and unattainable by many. So that to me brings a question back to the equity subcommittee and the entire panel to be thinking, what is the cost, how to like keep the cost under control, even under the traditional license system, which is obviously like what we've been talking about over the last year in general. So I bring that up to say that I like that, and I think it's really important that there's lower cost services available. I think that's one of the cool, maybe primary, maybe secondary effects of this particular proposal, which does a lot more than just lower costs. It does that, but it also does a lot of other things which are amazing. And then it makes me wonder, okay, from a consumer side perspective, like what if we set up a system, or what would it take to not set up a system where based on your income stream, you only have access to a certain kind of services and don't have the choice? Because ultimately, I think what we want is for people to have choice among these different options and not be required. So again, that brings in other questions of how to make the kind of more normative, I guess you could say, services available more affordable. And that gets to questions of like patient assistance funds and things that might be better for a different conversation. But I just want to bring up that connection that I see and how that I think increases, this being successful would increase the imperative of the rest of the system to make the services more affordable in my mind.
This is just such a nuanced subject, and I appreciate you raising that issue. I've raised to the board on multiple occasions the article by Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins about the pitfalls of psychedelic medicines. And he particularly warns against the use of, Buddha statues and Native American imagery and kind of religious symbolism in therapeutic setting, because they frankly don't really have a whole lot of place in the therapist's office. And there is a risk in people's suggestible states that you're planting, you're planting things that maybe shouldn't be planted without it being kind of a more deliberate kind of effort. So your concern, I think, is extremely valid, and I share it. Part of the way that the proposal would handle that is again, thanks to the Oregon Constitution, this protects non-religious ceremony also. So the hope that I have is that once, assuming this gets, or something like this gets adopted and it kind of enters into the general psilocybin marketplace in Oregon, that there will be kind of a diverse marketplace that has, and a marketplace might not be the best word for it, but kind of diverse offerings and options in communities where people can really find the one that resonates most with them, and that there'll be kind of a welcoming of newcomers into these communities, respectfully and carefully, so that they avoid the situation where perhaps to get if the only if this program is that successful, the entheogenic kind of program, then it produces like affordable services. We don't want people, and I think practitioners don't want non-serious people to come into their ceremony either. I think that's kind of, I think these people should find each other, both the entheogenic practitioners and the non-entheogenic practitioners. I mean, we want to, like, finding the right match is really important. So hopefully by having non-religious entheogenic practitioners allowed, there can be, a less religious kind of setting to get the same thing. But at some level, the group ceremony is always going to be cheaper than one-on-one kind of psychotherapy. And I don't know a way around that, because if you have, a one-on-one session that's more therapeutic in its orientation, you're just with the facilitator to client issues to begin with, there's kind of no way that I know around that. So that unless it's a group therapy session, which should also be allowed, I think, but so maybe something along that line could help that. But that's not the same as people, perhaps a therapeutic group could become an entheogenic group after a while, but it's just kind of an attempt at creating a more community container to, that wouldn't necessarily, but I share your concern, and that's how I've kind of tried to resolve it within the framework. Rebecca.
Yes, thank you. This is Rebecca Martinez for the record. I think I guess for me, it seems like we really are talking about a spectrum of things. And so I think I'm still sort of trying to make sense of where everything fits. So for instance, with Alma Institute, we're seeking to prioritize facilitators who are not already therapists or clinicians to come in. And then when we look at the community needs and interest survey that just came in, we saw that more people are seeking to use psilocybin for wellness than things like depression. And so I guess I'm struggling to see how, let me just sort of talk this out for a moment. Maybe it'll be helpful. As I was first listening, it seems like the way you described it, sort of like this corner of the program, that like under certain situations, like groups of sincere practice would be able to, get special privileges. The way I imagine if this were opened up, and not to say I'm against it whatsoever, is that, I almost think like, well, I myself, like there's many of us who would say, well, I identify more with the spiritual practice of mushrooms than the therapeutic. Even therapists who are coming to become facilitators would say, I'm not practicing psychedelic therapy. This is a spiritual practice. And so I think what could happen is we end up sort of upending the whole program, not to say yay or nay about that one way or another, but I think the question that comes up for me is then what are we asking the Oregon Health Authority to actually administer? Is that what was written into the statute? Do they even have the authority to administer something? And then are they juggling two very different things where one, like for instance, if what is to really say whether a group has a sincere practice or not? And then if we're turning over so much of the onus to the communities to, okay, well, you tell us when a facilitator is ready. For me, it's just a really tough sell to imagine the Oregon Health Authority signing on to a program with so much that could be perceived as unwieldy. It's like we're asking them to be responsible for something, but also to have very little hand in it. And so I guess I'm having trouble reconciling those tensions. And I also welcome if Jesse has any, like, are we going down a road that
like, Rebecca, I have to jump in here and say the OMMP is exactly that.
Can you say that again, Rachel?
Oregon Medical Marijuana Program, right? I feel like we sort of, I love everything you said, and I would actually not use that word upend, right? Because that means that we all agreed that Measure 109 creates a therapy program, right? A medical program for Oregonians with mental health needs, right? Only. I know that's what the platform, that's how the platform presented the measure, back in 2020. But I think a lot of us, appreciate the broad landscape that Measure 109 did create to invite a variety of activities that really bring color to the prescribed process, right, that clients have to flow through in these service centers. I like to juxtapose this program against the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program that did not create a care framework at all whatsoever, right? By way, we have dispensary attendants giving medical advice and offering management to patients and adult consumers alike with no oversight, no checks and balances, no accountability whatsoever. So by virtue of that program existing as it is and the sky not falling, I think the freedoms that John's proposal create are, by comparison, very conservative, right? And appropriate for well-meaning adults who want to open up businesses that provide services to people that meet them where they're at.
Thank you, Dr. Knox. I appreciate you saying that there are some aspects of this that are relatively conservative, particularly in the light that's already available federally, right? We're here because Oregon v. Smith, basically Oregon decided that it wanted to not permit psychedelic religious practice under its constitution. So, the conversation has moved on dramatically in the last 30 years about this. And, Oregon just has a chance to really right the wrong here and not be just unnecessarily restrictive. And I keep coming back to, these communities really are self-regulating and are, I just don't think that there's really a lot to be afraid of here, because I think when people come together in community, that has just by its own nature, its own kind of mechanisms of accountability outside of the health authority. And, I just don't know if this is like quite as, but you're right, its effects are unknown of how much, what percentage of the Oregon program would be operating under an entheogenic kind of privilege basis. And it could be substantial. And I think part of that is we're still, as a society, searching for the best container for psychedelic healing. And I just think that the ceremonial community container may ultimately prove to be the one that a majority of people find useful to them. And particularly if it's affordable and accessible and culturally sensitive and appropriate, then why wouldn't the state want to provide like an affordable pathway to that? So I think it really goes to how do we define container for psychedelic use in Oregon, and I think there's multiple containers, and I think of the entheogenic container as being kind of one of the parts of one expression of how psychedelic services, psilocybin services, could be kind of could be practiced under the measure, but but I think so far I think that at the board I've heard only talks of a few containers. I've heard of the microdose container, I've heard of the psychotherapy container, and I've heard of the wellness spa container, and maybe now recently a little more about the religious container. But I could even conceive there being other containers that are allowed clearly by the text of the measure. So this is just saying that because we have this long ancient history of kind of entheogenic practice, and that's where we got so-called magic mushrooms from, was a spiritual community container from the area in Huautla de Amanez in Mexico. Like we're just honoring kind of the tradition that from which we discovered mushrooms in the West. So anyway, so the question is the container, and it could be that more people prefer the community container, and I don't think we have to be afraid of that or be kind of off-put by that. I think that's actually, in some ways, maybe the best, most logical, natural place for it. But anyway, sorry.
John, can I just add to that? This is Dr. Rachel Knox for the record. Sometimes, the secondary outcome is the treatment of depression and anxiety, right? That is what we've seen in cannabis. We've seen people seek cannabis for all sorts of reasons, recreational ones, certainly, but just to, address well-being. And then all of a sudden, we see a concomitant reduction of prescription drugs for the conditions that people are allowed to use cannabis for in certain states, right? We are seeing in the adult use markets, the top 3 reasons people continue to go back and buy more cannabis are to address pain, sleep, and anxiety. In the adult use market, that everybody's calling recreational. It's wild. So I'm with you, John, right? I think it would be beautiful if therapists saw the utility and the opportunity within the community container and move that direction. I mean, isn't that what a lot of us want to see, right? And the end to the separation between conventional medicine and like true traditional original healing practices. I mean, I would love to see that. And I think that would be an amazing experiment to embark on with one another. So I really see this as just broadening the landscape of opportunity, and I really appreciate it. So I'll put a pin on it. Again, I see hands were raised before I jumped in there. Elon, I think you're next.
I'm in my car, so I might be kind of, I'm loving these conversations. And John, thank you for doing all that work. I got a chance to read the 50-something slides or look through them. And it was really nice to see how not limiting the community practice proposals that you had brought up. One of the things I want to go back to was what Izzy said about I think we were talking about spiritual practice versus therapy versus, I don't know, it was just like it was a while ago, so I kind of forgot. But one thing I do want to like point out is like, I love that this is happening. This is awesome. And I think everybody deserves the right to practice, to accept medicine in any way, shape, or form that they want to, and that this is one of those containers. And I resonate with the community container 100%. That's like where that's where I just like to be. And one of the things I've noticed when we're talking about, and not just within this group, other groups I've noticed and boards and stuff, is that when we're creating these containers, sometimes because it opens up a greater chance that more people will be involved, that the equity dynamics that are happening right now with only having one top to bottom route is very limiting. One thing I have noticed is that some people have said, well, people who are going to want therapy are going to be wanting to go, in the clinics and this and that. And the people who might want to be, they don't really want the therapy, they want to do the other thing, might want to go to a church or another route. And of course, I disagree, because there's no studies that have been done well enough that can prove those two things are true. And I want us to always make sure that we're not separating. I know as a Black person, a lot of people in my community do feel safer going under the community container, because we don't need to go there. We know the war on drugs. And so as long as we're doing this, I think we want to fight even harder for the business equity side, because we can accidentally I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but there is an opportunity for separation, as far as I'm saying, like the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, kind of this separation, like nonprofit, all this down here. And now that there's another outlet, there is always going to be the religious outlet, but to broaden it, I want to just always, as a group, make sure that like it's not because we're providing something that's not already there, because that is already there. And there's like a little exceptionalism that I've seen happening this last couple weeks. I'm like, oh gosh, feel right. And it is opening up these doors. Yeah, it is not like gonna upturn or upheave or whatever, but it is going to be a threat to people who are solely focused on the business side, because anytime that you can have what a lot of people have heard say, like the underground market, the grassroots, as long as we're going to be out there pumping on existing, it is a threat. I was thinking the other day, and I'm kind of talking like Izzy, I was like, gosh, Izzy, I have a brain dump too. I don't know how old I was young, and I lived across the street from Mama Medical Marijuana Clinic. And it was the first time, I think it was like 18, 17, that I was like, oh my gosh, there's a place, it's medical, but people are going in and they're seeing a physician and they're getting cards. They're getting hooked up with growers who are, I know I have tons of friends who are growers, and they had cards. And that's how I first was introduced to like plant medicine on a broader level. And I don't know if that kind of system can exist. Obviously that was only medical at the time and not like recreational, when everybody was allowed to start growing on their own, because that's going to happen too. I give a lot of education. I teach people how to grow edible mushrooms. There's not much of a difference. There's gonna be a lot of people who are receiving a wonderful education about providing them their own medicine and sharing with their communities how they're growing their own medicine. And I love that these containers can exist on the church level and with 109. So I'm just blabbing now.
Okay.
So as I'm trying.
That's important, Elon. Thank you.
Yeah.
That was important to hear.
Elon, you touched on so many really great points, and it's nice to meet you. So I think one of the benefits of the community container is it has the opportunity to reward value other than just money. I think some of I used to manage a legal aid office where we gave free legal help to really poor people and low-income communities in Oregon. And, many of the people who we serve, are limited to, a person who lives on disability or Social Security, can live off as little as $732 a month. And that's like a surprisingly large number of people. And so when you think about people who live along those lines, who may be living through a lot of trauma and, a lot of generational trauma, a lot of other broad, socio issues, and how are we going to include those communities within Measure 109? I really just haven't heard any proposal that comes anywhere close to including those communities, and it's heartbreaking on a certain level to think that Oregon's pioneering, groundbreaking psychedelic program could just really further social inequities, racial inequities, economic inequities, spiritual inequities, and it just like as Oregon is trying to tie down this thing where by 2050 it eliminates completely health inequity within the state of Oregon. As it's developing this new program, I just don't see how it could do it in a way, like how, if it takes that goal seriously, how it could implement a program that just kind of further deepens the divides between, people who have and people who have not. So, this is, an attempt to also create pathways to that I think the spiritual community container really is a good, safe way of providing kind of access along kind of the low margins in terms of socioeconomic status, as well as other statuses too of other marginalized communities. So that what you said kind of made me think of that, and I could go on, but there's other questions. So let's thank you, everyone. Izzy?
Thanks, and thank you, Alon. Yeah, I appreciated that comment also, because I think that actually the example of how people will first come into contact with access to the substance, I think is like a question to be thinking about from just a broad cultural perspective. But what I was just going to say, kind of adding on to the discussion we're in right now, but one thing that I feel is like limiting us in this discussion to a certain extent is what I'm interpreting as kind of a false binary between therapeutic use and sacramental use. And a few people have touched on that. And it's complicated because in the US, the kind of religious use framework is like fully firewalled for medical use, and the medical use, besides, yes, there's examples, like mystical experience being tracked and so on, and there's much more awareness within the realm of medicine about the importance of spiritual health. So I personally, maybe this goes without saying, but I personally believe that the two are extremely linked. And one thing that I think is a challenge that this proposal could kind of seek to answer is how to square that in a way that doesn't place these two systems against each other. I really have, as everyone on the subcommittee has heard me say probably a dozen times over the last year, have not liked the characterization, have resisted the characterization of 109 as a therapeutic model. I think it's an adult use system that incorporates a lot of different kinds, or that makes room for multiple different kinds of use. And recognizing that there's the most momentum around the medical use for good reason, it doesn't at all encompass the entire spectrum of why people utilize psychedelics. So I'm personally pretty resistant to, and I think that it may be true that there are downstream mental health benefits from that, from increasing access, but I'm a little bit resistant personally to tying community spiritual care environments to the treatment of specific indications, only because that, to me, and one of the things that requires the medical industry to be held to a higher standard is that they're making claims that consumers rely on. And I think from that perspective, it's really important for anyone making specific claims like that to have that. So I'm not necessarily worried about that in this situation, because I could see a differentiation. But I just bring that up to say that I think that there's ways to justify sacramental work that don't necessarily pit it against or as a binary with therapeutic work, is the first thing. And also, I still am wondering about like how, like, I agree with everything you're saying, John, on like the benefits of lowering the cost and this whole discussion we've been having, but I'm like, what what's stopping the relevant decision makers from bringing those considerations to as many of the use cases as possible, recognizing that there's plenty of technicalities and specificities there, but I'll pause there for now.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100%, Izzy. I think some of these ideas could be exported to the broader program to provide, kind of non-entheogenic, if a therapist's office could have co-located co-licensing between a service center and a manufacturer. If a therapist could grow, product in their spare office room or something like that, that would be another, the Oregon Health Authority could clearly do that. And I've, despite the desire to keep products really safe and really well tested, that really does drive up the cost. And I noticed in the testing rack, there was, the equity impact statement kind of touched on this, that this really does affect small businesses, and it affects potentially communities of color who may be kind of needing these services in some respects at higher levels in the general population because of racial and other trauma. So it's kind of and so there are aspects of it that I could be, and I would love to see exported, to elsewhere, but at least from my kind of vantage point of advocating for religious practice, it's pretty important that communities kind of retain the right to handle their sacrament in accordance with, if you can imagine what the Catholic Church would do if there were somebody coming in to kind of touch or mess with or inspect or test it's what it believes to be the literal body and blood of Christ. That there would be mass uproar, and so for an entheogenic community that really has strong convictions around these kinds of issues, it could be important to allow kind of the ability to kind of handle things appropriately. So yeah, thank you. Rebecca.
Thank you. This is Rebecca Martinez, and I'll try to make this my last one. I know I've been talking a lot today. I think one of the pieces that I keep coming back to also is the fact that this sort of practice is already happening and has been and continues to grow, and that many of us came to practicing with mushrooms and other entheogens through community-based groups, whether they were really structured and dogmatic in certain ways or more open. And so I think we're talking about risk reduction and not so much in the risk of associated with consuming psilocybin, but we're talking about community accountability and some level of protections, especially based on things we've seen in recent years and even in the last year, just around facilitator accountability. And so I suppose that's one of the major benefits I see and a potential of why a group would want to participate in like a 109 exempt type model, is that there is added sort of oversight. It's again walking this line of groups really shouldn't have oversight. The argument could be made. And so I guess I do wonder, would groups who have been practicing all this time see the benefit and want to participate and have trust in the OHA, and what would that actually entail? I think I don't have a grasp on that, but I hope that the OHA will consider that, which is this is continuing anyway. And I think that's probably part of the impetus for this whole conversation, which is if we create a false binary, then a ton of folks will choose not to participate in the legal program here in Oregon. And then we have equity and access problems, we have accountability problems. And so I think that's all really valid. I think I have more questions, but I'm just going to spend some time digesting this. And yeah, it's a lot, but it's helpful. And I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. I share that concern a lot. I don't know how many of the folks in this room have been listening to the Cover Story, this New York Magazine and Symposia podcast that basically has been exploring the issue of abuse in the underground. And I mean, this is just, it's just such an easy thing we could avoid by letting it be above ground, because the people, as they document very well in the series, when somebody is a victim of abuse, they may not feel comfortable going to authorities because they've committed a crime to be in that position. So why, there's a certain delicate act of, do they come out and report, go to law enforcement where law enforcement doesn't feel safe to them? So this is part of the reason why it's really incumbent on the state to invite entheogenic practice above ground and to create space for it, because it's really just going to, within the broader context of the war on drugs, it's just, when we live in a prohibitionist system, it results in a lot of harms that could just be easily avoided if people could file complaints without having to risk going to jail. It's just that simple. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here to really help a lot of people.
This is Dr. Rachel Knox, and I completely agree with that. It is better. In my opinion, it is safer to bring things into a properly regulated framework as a harm reduction tool. And I just wish that the powers that be, the institutions that be, would recognize that beyond psilocybin, well into cannabis, we're still struggling with this issue too. If we want to be able to hold folks accountable to certain standards, to certain ethics and morals, we have to bring them in, right? To, as you put it, a normative landscape. Hey, does anybody else have their hand up? Let me see.
Well, this is Ismail. Just to really quickly respond to that, I agree with that. And also, John, maybe you haven't heard the episode that was released this week, but the most recent episode of Cover Story is actually about a situation that occurred in the MAPS phase 2 trial. So I agree, and I say that intentionally to say that it is true that, and I believe strongly that bringing this work above ground will, because of the sunshine effect, kind of what you said, the idea that folks won't feel like they will be, they won't have consequences for the drug-related behavior because that activity will be safe. So they'll be more inclined to go forward and bring issues up to authorities. And also, we will continue to see things happen in the above ground. I just want to say that as a reality with respect to ethical violations. That is something that a lot can be done to prevent and needs to be done to continue to prevent. And I think that's part of it, but I also don't want to give the false impression that there's total security in the above ground, because we know that's not true. And worse, and you kind of touch on this, the current accountability mechanism in the above ground, except for the accountability that comes with licensure or certification, is law enforcement. And one of the complicated things about bringing things above ground is that people who have historically been somewhat bound, for better or worse, by their adversarial aspect and adversarial kind of positionality to law enforcement means that there's generally underreporting in the underground for fear of that association. That puts people in the above ground in this interesting position that I think we as a drug policy movement are going to have to reckon with, which is what happens when your accountability is law enforcement. And I'm not saying that that's the only option, but there aren't that many in between. And I know we talk about, and I won't go down the rabbit hole of restorative and transformative justice, but those practices take a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of energy. And more often than not, I see people default to the easy punishment option when possible, even in our, when we're not at our best selves. So I just want to say that to acknowledge that there is absolutely harm that happens in the above ground, and also good oversight, ethical practice or ethical norms, supervision, all the things that we've been talking about are able to reduce that. And I think when it comes to differentiations in accountability for, I'm struggling with the language, people who fall under 109's normative Rachel kind of framework and ones that fall under this, the reason I'm really in this place around how do you maintain accountability for those practitioners, my big question is what does parity look like? So practitioners that are differently situated on their approach of practice are still held to a comparable standard from an ethical perspective. And I think, just speaking from some of the examples we've seen come up in California. Like one of the things that comes up when people think about decriminalization or, you know, increasing scope of access, including and especially in religious use contexts, is the manipulability and the sensitivity and the desperation with which people come to psychedelics. And I think to your point, Rachel, that it kind of cuts both ways, where yes, it's true that people may seek kind of benefits for their mental health issues or other related issues through spiritual care practice. That's awesome and legitimate and really good for a lot of people. And also because they're showing up with a tremendous amount of vulnerability, the amount of care and attention that's offered and protection that's offered to those people does need to be comparable. That's why there's a reason that medical records, for example, are protected the way they are. And what happens when you have activities that are talked about as if they're medical, treated as if they're medical, the consumer thinks they're medical, but then they're not as protected as medical care. What that means is that people get taken advantage of, whether it's in a spiritual way or through the medical kind of psychiatric system. So I just think that establishing at least parity is important. And I'll end by just saying, recognizing that this is the first time that we've attempted to do this in the United States. And there's going to have to be regular review as we go forward about what works and doesn't work, what are barriers to entry that are effective, and which ones need to be changed. And how do we know? How do we collect the information so we know they need to be changed, and stay agile so we can change them instead of lock in bad policy that everyone is stuck with for longer than they want to be. Thanks.
Yeah, that's such a really good point, Izzy. So there is a formation of an organization in Oregon called the Entheogenic Practitioners Council of Oregon that will hopefully be continuing to kind of keep the kind of the pressure on, I guess, so to speak, to just continue to inform and educate about how entheogenic practice isn't really something that I think anyone needs to be afraid of. I don't think it's really threatening to public safety or public harm or anything like that. And I think a lot of people find value in healing, and kind of it's a lot of the wellness aspects and even the potentially mental health benefits. Although you're totally right, we don't talk about them in terms of diagnoses and in those terms. But you know, I think a lot of religious communities talk about healing. You know, I think on the Eyes on Oregon episode we had on Monday, the Episcopalian minister talked about how Jesus's ministry was a healing ministry. Like in many ways, that was one of his kind of primary ministries. And so, like the fact that there's kind of an overlap between you know, religious and healing isn't necessarily novel or new, and it's kind of most, you know, religions, I think, certainly even in the West, have kind of a marriage, if you will, between those two kind of aspects. So I don't think that would be, you know, grounds to be afraid of, you know, healing happening in a community context or religious context.
John, this is Rachel next. I have a comment and then a specific question about the proposed language here. My comment was in response to Izzy and your remark around parity. In part, I interpret that like parity to HIPAA. And so I just wanted to state that not all people or institutions are subject to HIPAA, right? So the average person, it cannot violate HIPAA because they're not subject to it, right? I would say the majority of service centers, for example, and facilitators through psilocybin services here in Oregon will not be subject to HIPAA.
Right, that's what I figured.
Right,
Yeah.
At all whatsoever, unless you already are, right? If you're already in a medical office and then you apply for a service center license, I don't think you can argue it the other way around either. Well, because I'm not operating as a a medical doctor right now, but a facilitator, therefore I'm not subject to HIPAA. I don't think that will fly. But I just wanted everybody to be aware about that. So I think your point is a really good one, and that we're going to have to ask ourselves, what does really like honoring, short of enforcing or even enforcing parity to HIPAA standards look like for us? And then my question, John, is from the privileges of entheogenic practitioner, section 2F, where manufacturers could provide psilocybin products to clients free of charge, provided that such giving does not violate Measure 109, Section 114.6. Could you give us an example of what that could be like? That particular language there in Measure 109 says you cannot discount or give psilocybin products for free if sold in the context of other services. Just sort of not clear itself, but just can you color there?
I think that's I had been operating for a while under the misunderstanding that the measure itself prohibited gifting psilocybin away at any point. And it turns out that's actually not the case. The measure actually does use the term gift in its definition of the term. I think retail sales, so anytime the measure refers to sales, it includes gifting. So that's written into the measure. So it's clearly allowed that that gifting is okay. But there is this caveat in that section that you just referenced that says you can't just you can't basically include, my understanding of this, and of course, ultimately it's OHA's interpretation here, but my understanding of that provision is that you can't really just say you're giving it away as a workaround to the tax that gets applied at the product level. So if you could give services and products away, but you can't just say like free products included in the cost of service, because then that would avoid the tax. So if a community had members that were coming to it who didn't have financial means, there's nothing in Measure 109 that would stop the community from giving all expenses paid services. And that's totally allowed, as long, you would imagine that either volunteer facilitators or else maybe the community could subsidize the cost of facilitators through other members or something like that. So there is kind of this free option that is available under Measure 109. And so again, I don't imagine that that the language in there would be required, because I don't think OHA will come down with a rule that otherwise prohibits gifting. But in the absence of knowing what the other rules are, this does create, this wants to protect basically the right of a community to give free products and services to its members.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, I'm just checking our time. This was such a great conversation. So we did move into the agenda item that was priorities for 2022, which I would like to move to next meeting, because we still want to honor our time for public comment. So in the meantime, I will say thank you, John, for joining us today and engaging in this conversation with us. Next meeting, I will have on our agenda a motion to recommend, right, up to the board your proposal. Another thing I want to propose next meeting and motion is to recommend a sacramental liberty and sacred practice subcommittee to the Psilocybin Advisory Board. I think it's overdue. I don't think this matter is something that the equity subcommittee, for example, should take up on its own. It's just as big as equity, from my perspective. Equity being so broad in and of itself, I think that in the spirit of psilocybin and entheogens everywhere, I think it's time. It's time that we center this conversation properly and advise the Psilocybin board properly from a group of folks who know this, right? And who can advocate on behalf of sacramental use and sacred practice best. We'll see, we can see how far that goes. My secondary suggestion, right, if there's no appetite for creating a subcommittee for that specific, is to alternate our existing equity subcommittee meetings for that, right? So in effect, our equity subcommittee would host that subcommittee. So I will bring that forth next week or next meeting for us to discuss and vote on. Other than that, I want to know y'all's appetite for this conversation versus just going right into public comment. And that was recognizing that we might benefit from some space to discuss the aftermath of the board's conflict of interest discussion last month, because several articles did emerge in which we were, heavily focused on that conversation in particular and board members in particular. And if whether y'all want to go ahead and declare our own conflicts of interest next meeting. All right, Kevin Fitz.
Yeah, hi, Kevin Fitz here. I just want to say I really appreciated John's presentation. And one thing I wanted to add, I don't know if people are aware of it, there's 4.2 million people in Oregon. There's 1.4 million of those people are low-income folks in poverty and with disabilities who are OHA customers. I sometimes find it unconscionable that this whole measure is moving forward and individuals with low income and poverty will not be able to afford or have this service. Thanks again, John, for your presentation. It was enlightening.
John, I see your hand up as well.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Kevin. Thank you for giving this your attention and care. My question was just going to be about, I know we are coming up on deadlines for subcommittee recommendations. And I didn't remember if that deadline happened to be before the next equity subcommittee meeting, but I just wanted to make sure that we wouldn't, if a vote were delayed until that future meeting, that we wouldn't be kind of losing the window to pass a recommendation on that issue.
We don't have quorum today, John, so we wouldn't be able to take a vote. But we'll be sure to make sure all the subcommittee members are aware that we intend to take a vote next meeting. A couple of us also are part of the licensing subcommittee tomorrow. I think 2 of us, Anne Marie and myself, where a vote will be taking place.
Yeah, this is Anne Marie for the record, and I'm helping facilitate that meeting tomorrow, and there will be a vote, I believe.
Oh, but to answer your question, yeah, the equity subcommittee does meet before the board meeting for the month.
I think I had it on my schedule that the board meeting was Wednesday and then the equity subcommittee was the following Friday. I just
let me check. I don't want to speak too soon.
It feels weird for me to call on you, Jesse, but
I think Dr. Knox may have her eyes away from the screen. I was just going to provide some dates. The next equity subcommittee is scheduled for the 18th of March, and the board meeting is on the 16th of March. We gave a self-imposed deadline to the subcommittees to finish their recommendations by March, so that the full board would have April, May, and June to consider all recommendations. So
Hey,
anything
Jesse,
that, yes,
on my
go.
calendar, it says the Psilocybin Advisory Board's March 23rd. We
One
typically
moment, please.
Typically are the 4th Wednesday of the month.
I believe we changed this month for spring break.
Did we? Okay, it's still on my calendar.
Verified that it is the 16th. Yes.
Okay. Well, if we can all get updates to our calendars, that would be great, because my calendar does not reflect that. It's squarely on the 23rd still.
Okay.
Thank you.
thank you for that clarification, Jesse. Appreciate that.
Well, a quick related process kind of note on that. It sounds like this is a smile for the record, sorry. Obviously there's not a quorum today. My suspicion is that, most of the people haven't had a chance to really in-depth, do a deep dive into it. I only myself got a chance in the last few days. And Rachel, I know that I saw that John, you emailed the group and sent materials out with new language. I wonder if Rachel would be helpful for us to like set some sort of internal deadline just for this group to be sending in like email input on a thread with just us to make a determination. I don't know what the rules are on electronic voting or if that's a good idea, but I'm just saying that it would be good to get more input from more members of the subcommittee. I think either way, that's all I'm saying. So thanks.
I so wish we could do that, but we cannot.
Yeah, thanks. Oops.
Yeah. Yeah. So my bad. I did not know we had moved up our meeting. It wasn't reflected on my calendar. Typically, we have 2 equity subcommittees a month before the board meeting. So it's a little unfortunate. But yeah, right. All of us do have these materials. We can certainly send out an email for folks to get up to speed. I mean, watch back the licensing subcommittee presentation John gave, listen back to this meeting in preparation, right, for that meeting. It is not too late for us to make a recommendation to pass on to the board. I know we have this internal deadline, but I think it'll still be good to have on the record whether or not our subcommittee supports or not. Anne Marie is our liaison for the licensing subcommittee. I'm still a part of that subcommittee as well, so I think we'll cast our votes there accordingly. But yeah. Just by consensus, is everybody okay with having an agenda item next meeting? Going over our own conflicts of interest?
Anne Marie, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
This is a smile. Yeah, same.
Okay. All right. Does any other subcommittee members have anything they'd wish to say? Okay, well, I'm happy for us to move into public comment.
Thanks for the discussion today, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all. Jesse, I'm gonna hand it over to you, and then once we conclude a public comment, I will close this out. That works?
Thank you. I'll hand it over to Meredith
Okay.
with OHA to
Please.
take the public comment.
Yeah, I'll take care of that. So it looks like we have quite a few people with their hands up. So we've got until 5. So if you could keep your comments to a minute or 2, that would be great. And if there's anyone that is on the phone that wants to make a comment, you can raise or lower your hand by pressing *9. And I'm not sure if I actually said my name when I started talking, but I'm Meredith with OHA. And when you begin talking, if you could state your name for the record, that'd be great. So, and I'm just gonna go in the order that's in front of me. So first I have Robert Faust.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. This is Dr. Robert Faust. And I just had a few insights from listening here. But bottom line, I've got over 50 years of experience. I've been around a lot of people that have taken psilocybin back before it was even illegal. And so my experience over a half a century, including my own experience, is I don't know what the danger is. I mean, the idea of regulating to prevent, have safe practice. I've never seen anything happen, but I sure have with alcohol and other drugs, prescription drugs. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, it's already underground. It's already out there on a massive scale. So over-regulation just keeps it in the underground. It keeps it below. I mean, religion has been like that too. I mean, there's certain religions that have been underground, under the radar for centuries. And the thing of it is, if we put too much onerous restriction and cost on it, it'll just stay underground. And in fact, that'll increase because you're really promoting it at that point. It must be a forbidden fruit. And then, of course, the people that are low income or rural people, you know, are not going to be able to afford it or have access, but they definitely can harvest in the wild and they can easily grow their own. So it seems like the state's motive behind a lot of these things, like the medical marijuana or so-called recreational marijuana, is really income. So wouldn't it be easier just to have somebody just buy a permit? Okay, just pay up. I call it the bribe. It kind of reminds me of mafia days where you had to pay protection money. So that's how I see some of this stuff. So you pay, you get a permit, and then that keeps the cops from kicking your door down. So, I mean, it's going to go underground. And then if it's too regulated, that's like a subsidy. So that adds value to the underground practitioners or underground entrepreneurs, because the more enforcement, the higher the value and the more profit involved. So a lot of times regulation, certainly in the war of drugs, has created that scenario. But, you know, it's not dangerous and it's been used for centuries. So let's accept that fact. And if it's just about money, okay, I'll buy a permit, just like I have for medical marijuana. I'll buy a permit because it's insurance against, you know, getting my door kicked down and maybe getting shot by the cops. So bottom line is it's going to be out there no matter what you do. And so let's make it as least onerous as possible and more accessible. And as far as religion, where is religion and healing or religion and medicine? I mean, it's hard to separate the two. You've heard of faith healing and you've heard of shamanistic practices. I mean, where does psychedelic use and shamanistic practices and religion and healing, it's all part of the same. It's one and the same. So that's my main observation is, you know, what does freedom mean? You know, what's an inalienable right by our creator, you know? And so to try to regulate that, it hasn't worked so far. Like I say, I mean, there's an active underground in mushrooms going back to the 70s. And I've noticed it's more active than ever. There's more knowledge, there's more ability to do your own grow or to identify new species of psychedelic mushrooms, especially out here in the Coast Range. There's plenty of it. So how can you regulate it? But you could make it easy if you know, you could just make somebody have to qualify and buy a permit. Okay, then we're all good. That's my comment.
Thank you, Robert. Next we have Jody.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John, and all of the subcommittee members for a really great and important conversation. I want to say a few things, but first of all, I would like to point out that in the proposal on the second page at the top, number 3, under application for entheogenic practitioner privileges, number 4, it says the eligibility is limited to individuals who hold a psilocybin services facilitator license. So these people have to get the same exact training. They have to hold the same exact license, and they're subject to the laws of those licenses. So it's very important to, you know, end the discussion about are they going to be outside the system, because they have to get a license through training and to be a facilitator, just like everybody else. And they also have to, if they want to have a facility, they have to get a facility license as well. So they're not outside the system. They're just given additional privileges, the way that I read it, to do what they do. Secondly, I really suggest that everyone look into an article that the BeckleyFoundation.org released a couple of weeks ago titled Spirituality and the Healing Potential of Psychedelics, in which they addressed a recent study that the results were that patients who demonstrated the greatest improvement in their depression scores were those who had undergone a greater mystical experience during the psychedelic intervention. And lower peak experiences were reported in those with weaker therapeutic response. This is using the MEQ, the mystical experience quotient. And if you look at the study, those results are phenomenally different between those who had a mystical experience with the psilocybin and those who did not. They also flagged a study or cited a study there from Johns Hopkins on smoking cessation, and people who took psilocybin in the study to see if it would help them stop smoking, their positive outcomes were significantly correlated with the measures of mystical experience on the days that they had their sessions in terms of lasting remediation of the addiction. Nicotine works in the body the same way as all other addictions. So they're continuing to extend these studies into other populations. But what they're getting at here is that spirituality needs to be a part of psychedelic assisted therapy. So rather than seeing these as two distinct groups, these kinds of studies are pointing to the bridge between the two. The entheogenic practitioner has a lot to offer the clinical practitioner. The clinical practitioner isn't suited in their set and setting for inducing mystical experience, to the point that the Beckley Foundation concludes that they need to focus on bringing in a spiritual framework into psychedelic assisted therapy and reaching out to spiritual leaders to merge spirituality into the field of psychiatry. So they need what the entheogenic practitioners are doing, and they can benefit from it. And I see it more as an opportunity for collaboration by recognizing the two distinct branches and then encouraging them to network and work together. Lastly, I would also like everyone to take a look at an article in the Denver Post, also a few weeks ago, about a Jewish rabbi who facilitates sacred ceremony on behalf of a very small community of about 20, 25 people, who was arrested and charged with a first-degree felony for intent to distribute and all other kinds of horrible things by the Colorado police. Now, they don't yet have in Colorado a entheogenic practitioner's law or a licensed psilocybin access of any kind. It's just decriminalized. But this man is an ordained rabbi, practicing many years, experimenting with the mushrooms in his own lab to find properties within it that have not yet been identified that relate to various levels of mystical experience. And he's guiding people in the tradition of Kabbalah, which is an esoteric psychology, a metaphysical psychology that encompasses the entirety of the human, not just the human psychological level. And
Jody,
he's facing federal charges. So we can avoid that in Oregon if we can give more weight to this proposal to recognize those practitioners and give them privileges. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments, Jody. So we have quite a few hands up still, and we've been going a little long. So I'm just going to ask that everyone keeps their comments to around a minute. And I know that Brian, you had your hand up a long time ago, so I'm going to call on you next. But I'm not sure that we can hear you. I think you're off mute, but I don't hear your voice. I'm going to let you work on that. Yeah, we still can't hear you. I'm going to call on Prima next, but Brian, if you could try to get your audio working, that'd be great.
My name is Prema Sagara. I am part of Enlightened Life Sanctuary, which is a federally recognized church, and we house lineages of traditional initiation that work in this particular field. And this is a way to create an opening. The Entheogenic Practitioners Initiative is a way to create an opening for those who should be respected and honored much respect to Robert who spoke, in this program, because this program has become entirely too clinical. And in keeping with the spirit of the measure, I really pray that we will have something like this, or something that can be molded from this to create that opening, which is really essential to embody what the people of Oregon have voted on. We are believers in sacred science in our church, and all of the clinicians in our lineages, especially those in Asia, go back thousands of years. They wouldn't be licensed for anything in America, but I guarantee you they are some of the best, most effective clinicians in their fields, respectively. And so we will be forming a testing laboratory of our own. And if we are approved as part of the Entheogenic Practitioners Initiative, and then under that purview, that we will absolutely provide testing services to all those clinicians who require that people who are doing the testing do so in a way that is reverent and respectful of the spiritual beliefs and practices, and that those who it is, I'm stuttering, but I feel very intensely and passionately that the laboratory people should be able to hold themselves in a way that doesn't disrespect our sacraments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prema.
Check. Hello.
Hello?
Can anyone hear me? It's Brian.
Oh, I can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Is it okay if I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah. So this is my name is Brian Kim with Decriminalize Nature Portland. I just wanted to thank, first of all, I wanted to thank John for mentioning at the beginning, like, would Maria Sabina be allowed to practice, and could she afford treatment? I think it's a really important thing, and I think it's really clear from this that, you know, she would not be able to, in spite of the recommendations that y'all are making, because this is still a class gate cap system behind a licensing model. Like, I appreciate the desire to not call it a therapy only model. But, you know, as an adult use system, because it is a licensing based system, it is still going to be gate kept behind the people who can afford the licensing, the people who can afford to comply with the regulations in terms of manufacturing, and the people who can afford to comply with regulations in terms of facilities. That thing that Jody Ma just said a minute ago about these people being under the same licensing framework is 100% correct. And that means that regardless of whether this religious framework gets approved or not, this is going to replicate the same equity holes that are rife with this entire system. And like, the only way that we're actually going to be able to promote equity here, and what I would really like to see y'all recommend as a board, is the full decriminalization of cultivation and personal ceremonial use. Because the kind of people who are not going to be able to afford 501c3 licensing and compliance, the kind of people who are not going to be able to afford to get licensed under Measure 109, are the same kind of people who are going to remain underground if y'all do not fix this class-based licensing system. Like, it blows my mind that y'all think that this is religious freedom when they have to get the same licenses as the 109 facilitators. Like, Jody's 100% right. This is not a separate religiously free system. In order to do that, y'all would have to recommend decriminalization. Please do that. And anyone who wants to follow up, we're called Decriminalize Nature Portland. You can find us on Instagram. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We're going to need to stop the meeting in about 3 minutes, so I apologize that I let people talk long at the beginning. The next person that we have with a raised hand is Jim. And if you could keep your comment to a minute or less, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll try. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My camera is off, but microphone's working. Okay, I think that what we really want to focus on, what the board can actually do regarding regulations to lower the cost of psilocybin sessions by providing for group sessions where facilitators can be assisted by trained peers, which should decrease the number of facilitators required. You know, it should change the ratio. Now, the idea, I really appreciate this advocacy for religious groups. I mean, it's very important to my religious life. The mushroom has been for over half a century now. But like a lot of you, I realize you don't need an explicitly religious setting to have a profoundly religious experience. But what we need to do is provide for lower cost psilocybin services. Now, whether the group is religious or another nonprofit, like John was talking about, he was talking about having certified peers assist the facilitators in order to change that ratio so there don't have to be as many facilitators. I don't know whether you can really trust everybody that says they're religious to certify their own, but there are reputable organizations that certify harm reduction trained peer counselors. And I think Oregon, eventually authorities could also be open to certifying homegrown harm reduction programs for this purpose. And if you have enough harm reduction counselors, it should change the ratio. And that's what I wanted to say. So thanks a lot.
All right, thanks, Jim. Jesse's gonna need to hop off the call in a minute, but I can stay on and let everyone else that has their hand up right now speak. That's about 6 of you, and if you could keep your comments to around a minute, that would be great. So next we have Jason Scott.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, John, and thank you to everybody on the Equity Subcommittee for hosting this and entertaining this. And thank you, Rachel. The first thing I want to say is I definitely think having some sort of entheogetic subcommittee, or however I can't remember how you phrased it, but I think having a subcommittee to interface with the OHA on this specific topic would be really helpful. And I'm just going to leave it at that for now, just in the sake of time.
Thank you, Jason. Next we have Eric and Courtney.
Hey, hello. Thank you for taking my comment. Yeah, we are founders of Sanctuary Church, a psilocybin-based church in Kentucky, and are looking forward to hopefully participating in Oregon with our Oregon residents. Sorry, my son's in the background. And one of the things that I think is really important that we bring up is the notion of cubensis as the only sacrament. I understand that there are issues around wild harvest and cultivated, et cetera, et cetera. For our church, we use primarily wild harvested Psilocybe ovoidiosa stidiata, which is a wood-loving mushroom that is ubiquitous all over the United States. Actually, it's becoming really common. And, if we're going to be talking about religious practice, if we're going to be talking about modeling, or at least, giving homage to indigenous practice, then I think that we're doing an enormous disservice by limiting ourselves to just this cultivated cubensis. Psilocybe cubensis is actually the least respected of all the sacred mushrooms. And in traditional shamanism and Mesoamerican culture, there are a number of varieties of psilocybe mushrooms that are consumed for various reasons, and each one has specific healing properties. And so I don't think this is a small thing. I think this is actually a really important aspect of sacred practice that needs to be considered. So, I don't know how we really bring that into the conversation. I think there's a lot of, I don't know, seems like there's several hurdles to jump around that, but it feels like a very important thing to us. We have seen beyond the shadow of a doubt, when you speak of the mystical experience, the set and setting obviously having such a huge role in that, probably more so than the chemical components of the mushrooms themselves. And our practitioners feel that a wild harvested mushroom connects them more closely to their creator and facilitates more of a mystical experience. And if we're going for healing, then that is a really important factor to consider. So that's really all I want to introduce to the conversation. I haven't heard it mentioned yet, and I do think it is really, really important as a very long-term practitioner myself.
Thank you for that comment. Next we have Alex.
Hey, thanks everybody for having me.
There.
I want to just get straight to it that in my opinion, it's wrong that we're trying to form a therapy model, or whatever you would call it, before we have full decriminalization for everybody. In my opinion, I think a lot of people here would agree that everybody needs to be allowed to grow mushrooms and eat mushrooms on their own. in the same way that people can make their own alcohol at home without having to worry about limits, and that they can then, if they want to, invite their friends over to have a party where they all drink those alcohol, like that's all great and fine. Unfortunately, cannabis has limits, but we need to be decriminalized so that everybody can have access to this. And then we can start looking at what therapy models are going to look like once we have that basic framework. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense to me. Also, what doesn't make sense is how this, we're talking about putting tax here when we're also talking about religious in the same context. And that's something that I'd like to see explained more, when you're talking about putting tax on mushrooms, but you're also saying that it's a religious thing. That just, to me, it doesn't line up. And finally, it's like, in my opinion, we're not going to know what this thing needs to look like until it's had some time to form organically and above the ground. And instead of trying to figure out what restrictions we're going to put on it, which is essentially what this whole thing is, we need to be figuring out how we can allow as much of it as possible to happen. That way we can start looking and come back to it in 2 to 5 years and say, okay, here's what works, here's what didn't, instead of trying to figure out how we're going to start restricting things before we even really know what things are going to look like. And just to the last person who just spoke, your point, what this looks like for people who don't want to go through this system, it looks the exact same for people that don't want to use magic mushrooms as their sacrament of choice for healing other people. And that's something that we need guidance on. I'm Alex Wilson. I'm lead organizer of Decriminalized Nature. And just like Brian had said, please reach out to us. Everybody, in my opinion, that's on this call should be working together to pass decriminalization first and forever before we're giving any kind of incentive or priority to legal frameworks. I'm complete. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. And next we have Sine.
Hi, this is Sine. I want to agree with everything that Alex and Brian said regarding the efforts around decriminalization. I think equity won't be delivered until we all have agency over the medicine that we choose to grow and use and gift. Around this specific proposal that we're talking about today, I think that the intent of it is really good, and I'm glad that this conversation is happening. I am concerned in light of the licensing requirements within the proposal that many people have brought up, that what it will actually achieve is increased access for the nonprofit sector and not increased access or equity for Oregonians. So I would just ask that the subcommittee carefully examine this proposal to ensure that it is going to achieve what we are trying to have it achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Sine. All right, last speaker that we have for today is Kyle.
Hi, this is Kyle Meyer for the record. I guess, first I just wanted to applaud John on the phenomenal efforts for this very important topic of discussion and the points of consideration before the board. I do want to express, however, some concerns just because I do feel like there's really, a few avenues that may or may not be feasible with it. One being the advent of a completely new license category, or creating some sort of subcategory within an existing license framework, and then having it defined based on truly what I think the rest of the board at large will be concerned about, which is exemptions to other recommendations and other legal considerations for the measure. In the same way that I've, posed the suggestion to the board regarding a research license, in that case with no intent for human consumption, but in pursuing the ability to explore some of these outstanding knowledge gaps, I think that's the same sort of considerations that are going to be applied here. And as such, it's going to just require some really airtight language and acknowledgement of the exemptions that will be, both implied and directly stated in that process. All of that being said, I think ultimately the exemptions consideration, does make it ultimately probably impossible to achieve the parity that Izzy was talking about in the broadest sense of the other existing license categories. So I just don't see there's any way that it's possible to reconcile that end of things. But nonetheless, I think that the inclusion of this is an absolute imperative, and must be considered by the board as a whole. So in any case, thank you for the time, and hope I didn't run too far over.
Thank you for your comments, Kyle. And thanks everyone for staying late.
All
Have a good
right,
evening.
Meredith, I will close us out, please.
Oh yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Thanks. And I just want to quickly sort of reorient the room. Just to clarify, we are a subcommittee to an advisory body to OHA as they implement Measure 109. So, our efforts cannot change legislation as we know it. In our own individual capacity, though, yep, we can certainly support decriminalization efforts of earth medicines and the people who use and consume them. So I wanted to get that out of the way, reset people's expectations around what kind of authority our subcommittee and our advisory board has. It's not a whole lot. That being said, I want to thank John Dennis again for joining us and for all the work you and others have done to bring this proposal to our board for consideration. Thank you to our subcommittee who continues to show up and have the holistic conversation. And then members of the public, thank you so much for joining us as well and bringing your thoughtful comments and recommendations forth. We will see you again on the 18th. So I hope we have such a large gathering then. And yeah, everyone have a wonderful evening otherwise. Much love.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.